Okay, it should be recording. I don't know if you guys can see that. Okay.
Yep. All right. So should I go ahead and get started? Does that work? Okay. All right. So hello, everyone that's already been there while we were talking. So I guess officially welcome. So if you didn't catch it from the prior talk, my name's Chris Bopp. I was at CU up until a year and a half ago, where I worked with Dr. Amy Voida, which maybe some of you know her. So yeah, about a year and a half ago, I finished my PhD, and now I'm in Western New York near Buffalo, and I'm an assistant professor of computer science. And so, what I'm going to talk about today. So, as I understand it, your group, is the goal is to work with nonprofits and technology, and that's exactly my area of research. I also, before I started the PhD at CU, I worked with a couple of nonprofits in Colorado, Rocky Mountain PBS, and the Children's Hospital of Colorado. And then before that, I was actually in Chicago when I worked at the AIDS Foundation as the IT manager there. So nonprofits and technology, I'm glad to hear that you all are interested in that. Nonprofits definitely need people who know things about technology, and it's certainly rewarding work. I mean, I like working with nonprofits. I mean, yes, I like technology, but nonprofits are really why I do what I do. So so excited to meet with you all and tell you a little bit about what I've learned over the last, I don't even know how many years. Primarily what I'll talk about today is my research and kind of what I found in my research. But then I'm also happy to talk about, what it was like being an IT person at the AIDS Foundation or whatnot. All right, so the title of my slides, Designing Data Systems for Nonprofit Organizations. I kind of have framed this because I know you all want to go out and work with nonprofits. So a lot of what I have to say from a research perspective is not super encouraging. This is a very challenging sector to work in, and there's a lot of things that really aren't working the way maybe we want them to. So I titled it this way to try and be encouraging. I'm going to say a lot of things that are like, yeah, things aren't really working very well. But I'm going to end it by talking about how I think we can, as people who want to go out and build technology for nonprofits, what can we actually do that actually is a good thing? But I don't have all the answers. I have a lot more questions than I have answers. So, all right. So let me go to the next slide. All right. So I wanted to start out by just kind of talking about kind of the discourse, I guess, is the term I use. So the way that people are talking about nonprofit technology. And in particular, I'm really interested in information science and data science. And, what are the things that people are talking about when it comes to data science? So, people talk about, especially if you go and talk to computer scientists who are, super into the technology and not so much into the application of the technology, it seems like a really, really cool thing. And a lot of business people think it's a really, really cool thing. A lot of nonprofit, a lot of people think data-driven decision-making is really, really cool. And so you can see here, these are, two articles that I just found. I just did a quick Google search and found these two articles. The first one is from Harvard Business School, talking about the advantages of data-driven decision-making, allows you to better understand the impact that any decision you make will have on your business. The other one's a little bit more direct. And then this Forbes article says, data-driven organizations are seeing upwards of 20 to 30% improvements in EBITDA, which if you're an accounting person, maybe you've heard that before. It's the first time I saw it, but it's basically like profit. that's probably a gross oversimplification, but basically we're able to make a lot more money because we are using data-driven decision-making. So there's a lot of this kind of talk happening around kind of data. So, you know, and the nonprofit space that's not unique, or that's not unique to just the for-profit space. Nonprofits are experiencing this as well. They're feeling that pressure to make data-driven decision-making. So this is I think this is like a professional certificate or something from Northwestern. And it says nonprofit data analytics and impact, harness the power of data in your organization. And then that red underlined bit says nonprofit leaders need to harness the power of that data to make decisions on how to survive and thrive in today's competitive environment. So, you know, even in the nonprofit space, we're really talking about, you know, we have to be innovative. We have to be on the cutting edge. We have to, you know, really use data to make decisions. And, you know, I think a lot of us can, you know, I'm a scientist. I believe in data. I think data is a good thing. So I'm not necessarily knocking data, but I think it's just important for us to kind of think about the way that kind of the world that we're operating within, it kind of has this implicit value of data. And technology, you know, if you apply technology to anything, everyone kind of automatically thinks it's cool. So, you know, we have to be careful about that, especially in the space of nonprofits, because nonprofits are doing really, really important work and working with marginalized populations and working on really, really hard social problems. And so I think we have to be really careful about, you know, kind of our approaches in the space. So, you know, one of the things that we referred to this kind of language, these conversations that happen, we called it anticipatory discourse. So, you know, we can think about it like before we even install an app on our phone or on our computer, or, you know, go into a new project, this discourse, this anticipatory discourse kind of shapes like how we're thinking about the you know, the context that we're going within. So we see it, you know, we talk to other people about like, hey, did you use that app? You know, or like, you know, people talk to one another and talk and kind of ramp up or amp up a technology. You know, we read news articles about, you know, kind of talking about the power of the technology. Advertising is, you know, particularly effective at convincing us that we absolutely need this technology and it's going to change our lives and it's going to make everything better. And then, of course, product websites are also kind of giving that language that causes us to kind of go into a setting, whether it's a nonprofit organization, or it's just our, you know, our phone or our personal life. We kind of have this kind of framework that we're kind of approaching things from before we even start using the technology. So, you know, and so, you know, this anticipatory discourse, we see this in the nonprofit space as well. You know, and we often get these interesting things that I've myself and Dr. Voida and our collaborator Ellie Harmon analyzed in terms of, you know, kind of looking at that intersection of nonprofits and technology and how we talk about these things. So, you know, I don't know if this organization still exists, but it was when we did this study in 2017. It was an organization called Hand Up, and it was framed as Kickstarter for the homeless, which is I have a lot of strong feelings when I hear that. You know, there's a lot of implicit assumptions that Kickstarter is good, revolutionary. And so if we apply it to something like homelessness, it's going to revolutionize or something like that, right? We also see that, so Blackbaud, if you all aren't familiar with Blackbaud, you definitely should be familiar with Blackbaud. They are the software provider in the nonprofit space. You pretty much will not find any nonprofit that has been around for a while and has a couple employees, they will be using a Blackbaud product, typically for fundraising, but a lot of organizations use their software. So, and this is a screenshot from their website that says drive more good more effectively, right? So it's the same idea, like we're kind of setting up these expectations of what is technology going to do. And so, I think, this is why I prefaced the presentation with the fact that, like, I'm going to, kind of talk about how technology is not going to save us and how technology is not going to be great. So you can probably see how I'm kind of like hinting at this here. So I'm about to, like, kind of, drop the ball and ruin the day. And so the question is, is all this technology, is it working as we kind of, think it should, right? And so based upon my research, I'm only one researcher. I don't have the complete picture. I don't know. I haven't talked to everyone in the nonprofit space. But pretty much everyone I talk to says that no, it is not working. It is not the technology. We're spending a lot of time, collecting data, setting up technology, buying technology, and ultimately at the end of the day, it's not really working for us. And so my research is all about the why. So why is it not working, right? And maybe that will change over time. Maybe nonprofits will actually, this technology will start to work better. And that is to say, I don't want to make any claims that I know how every nonprofit's doing. A lot of nonprofits really actually see a lot of value in technology and in a lot of value in data. So I don't mean to say that this is the way the whole nonprofit sector is. That's kind of my caveat before I go into this stuff. But based upon the organizations I've talked to, the nonprofit staff, the clients that I've talked to, it's not really working super well. There's definitely room for improvement. So what is the room for improvement? And so before I talk about, like, what specifically my research has found to be kind of the things that we need to take into consideration, I want to tell you a little bit more about what my research is and how I do that. So my research, I've worked with everyone from funders to nonprofit staff to management, and most recently, I have involved people, what nonprofit organizations typically call clients, which I hate that term. It implies this kind of serving relationship, but that's the term that's often used. So in my most recent study, so my most recent work has been in the area of homelessness in Boulder and the Front Range. And so in my most recent study, I did involve people who were either currently or had formerly experienced homelessness. So I'm really trying to get as many different voices into the research as possible. Obviously, it is largely geared towards staff. They're a little bit easier to talk to and set up meetings with. But I am trying to involve more so-called nonprofit clients. Other research, as I mentioned before, I've worked at HIV/AIDS organization in Chicago. So those are really the two main areas that I've worked in: homelessness and HIV/AIDS. And that's really just a function of I got a job in Chicago at the AIDS Foundation, and most of the work we did was obviously about HIV/AIDS, and homelessness was the other big area that we worked on, because a lot of people who were HIV positive also experienced housing issues. So those are the two main areas. Most of my research, well, all of my research uses qualitative methods. So I mostly interview people, which is, I'm biased, but I think the best kind of research because it's fun to talk to people about their experiences and what they know. So it's mostly been interviews, but then I've also done recently with that homelessness study, I did these things called design workshops, where I had people kind of come in, sit around a table. This was pre-COVID, actually, and work on looking at data forms and talking about data forms. So, so really, all of my research kind of falls into this area, like I said before, human-computer interaction, which is a subdiscipline of computer science. So that's kind of background on like where I'm coming from, what my research looks like. So let me pause there and feel free to interrupt at any point if there's any questions. Any questions at this point before I start talking about more stuff? Okay. So like I said, feel free to just interrupt if something I'm saying is confusing or you have a question. All right, so so this is kind of an entire PhD on one slide. So kind of the bullet points here. So the first one is about funders. And so in this space, in the nonprofit space, obviously you have people who give money, right? That's kind of, I always laugh at how much the nonprofit sector is actually about money. You would think that being called nonprofit, you would never have to talk about money, but actually I've found that nonprofits talk about money way more than the for-profit companies that I've worked for. So funders and making funders happy is a central part of nonprofit organizations. And so people who are giving money, whether they be individual donors, like just, someone down the street from the organization, or large, corporate donors like, Amazon, or philanthropists like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for example, right? All of them have particular needs. They all have particular things that they want, types of programs that they want to fund, types of things that they want to see. And so as a result, they actually have a fair amount of influence over, if you're holding the check above the nonprofit and saying like, I'm going to give you this money, but only if you do this program the way I want you to do it. And so nonprofits are really shaped quite a bit. And especially when we talk about technology and mostly about data in particular, nonprofits are having to kind of make sense of multiple funders' requests, and so a single nonprofit program could have 8, 9, 10 different funders. Each funder wants a different piece of data in the final report. And so nonprofits have to figure out like, okay, this funder wants the ages of participants in this particular format. And this funder wants, socioeconomic background in this particular format. And, and we have to reconcile all that. So a lot of nonprofit data work is just making sense of what funders want. So that's kind of the first bullet point, which kind of pulls in, relates to that second bullet point, which is really about, what kinds of data that means that nonprofits end up collecting. Is it ends up being a lot of data for accountability purposes. And I'll talk about this more. I think this is really problematic in the homelessness space because it amounts to basically surveillance and tracking people who are homeless, to provide data to the federal government. That kind of data, if we're focused on tracking people, we're not really focused on using the data for improving services, doing things that nonprofits actually care about, and the reason we all want to work with nonprofits, right? So that's kind of troubling. Not to say that it has to be that way, and that's hopefully something that we all can help nonprofits figure out how to shift that focus from funders to programs, and hopefully we can do that. But just know that we're kind of up against a strong influence, and that's the funding organizations. So that's the second bullet point. The third bullet point really is about data in and of itself. And, if you've done any kinds of surveys or, any kinds of research, that, certain types of data aren't really, you can't really, like, you could send out a survey to a bunch of people and you get those survey results back. And then you're like, but wait, I still have so many questions, right? There's still so many things that you want to know about, and that doesn't make any sense. And so human beings are really not, we can't really be reduced to data super well. And so when you're a nonprofit organization in particular, you have the programs that you're trying to do really require you to understand human beings in complex situations, right? Like if you're trying to understand why someone is experiencing homelessness, right? That's a complicated answer. That's not just like fill out the survey and, oh, now I know. It's really hard. The context that nonprofits are working in is really, really hard to get the kind of data that you need to make decisions, right? So kind of those three first bullet points are really kind of coming together to kind of build this really complicated context in which we really struggle to collect data on. And then finally the last one's kind of pulling it all together. And really, because we have lots of people with lots of different opinions, we have data that doesn't really work super well for understanding what we're trying to understand. Nonprofits just don't, at least the nonprofits that I've worked with, again, there's the larger ones certainly have strategies, have visions, right? They have a lot of things. And most of the nonprofits that I work with in my research are, maximum 20 employees. So not super large nonprofits. The AIDS Foundation that I worked at, we had like 50 employees, and I was actually one of two IT people. But most nonprofits, most small, 20 employee or less nonprofits don't even have IT staff. So, there's really no one, and that's why it's so important that we have people like you all who are willing to go out into nonprofits and help them with technology, because a lot of nonprofits just don't, they don't have anyone who works there who knows anything about technology. And well, I guess that was the only one. I don't know why I said A. They don't have people there, right? So we need to go in and as long as we understand this context, right? We don't want to go in and do more damage. So as long as we understand this context, it's really a good thing, I think. So, the point being there, this last bullet point, is that there's no kind of strategic, cohesive vision for technology. Most nonprofits are just kind of like, yep, that looks good, let's do that, right? Like, oh, someone mentioned they use this platform and it worked for them and I have no idea what it is, or there's a better option, but we're going to go with this one because that other person happened to mention it while I saw them at the grocery store, So I think, it's, there's just really no vision necessarily. So let me talk a little bit about, talk a little bit more in detail about some of these things. So that accountability, right? So I always like to include quotes because I do qualitative research, and you have to include quotes. So so accountability focus, right? So here's this quote from this person worked at a nonprofit. So she was she's a executive director of a nonprofit in Colorado. And she said, "We get caught up in reporting the indicators that are required to the people that are paying the bills, rather than necessarily taking the space to step back and look at that whole picture." So really it's, they just have to focus so much on getting the data for the people who are providing the funding that, they don't have time to kind of take a step back and look at the bigger picture and strategize. This is another executive director of an organization in Colorado. And so they're talking about kind of the evolution that they've seen over the last 20 years. So 20 years ago, output data was really the only thing that we had, and that's all that people asked for. So like output data, if you haven't run into this term in the nonprofit space, output data is really just like, this example he gives here, how many people did you serve? So this was a homeless shelter. How many people, over the course of the year, what was the number of people that came and stayed at the shelter? That's an output metric. That's pretty simple to calculate, right? We can just count people every night and then add that up. But they're saying that, for sophisticated funders, output data really isn't enough anymore, right? So they want to move from I always get these words mixed up, move from output data, which is that simple metric, to outcome data. And so outcomes are like, how are you changing people's lives, and how are you getting, getting people stably housed and stuff like that, and how are you shifting the public's perception of homelessness, right? Those are difficult things to measure, but that's more and more what funders want, which makes sense, right? Like that's actually what we should be paying attention to. So I don't disagree with that. I think that's good. But as I talked about before, it's really hard to measure those things, right? So we can count the number of people who come to the shelter per night, but it's hard to figure out if we're like actually ending homelessness, right? That's the language that everyone always uses is, what is our plan to end homelessness? How are we on track to end homelessness? Well, we've been trying to end homelessness for decades, and it hasn't been ended. So maybe that's not the best way to be thinking about it, but that's a whole nother topic. So that's the accountability focus. The other thing that I really am really interested in is this idea of like kind of surveillance. So I talked about that the way we describe the term we use to refer to people who are receiving services from our nonprofits as clients. It kind of has this like hierarchical structure to it. Like, we are the providers and you are our clients. You are like our customers. And so, surveillance, I think, is a really important thing to be, paying attention to here. So this quote, again, this is from a homeless shelter in Colorado. In a very just like concrete way, we can only have 160 people at the shelter a night. They can only have 90 stays. So making sure that we are keeping track of who's had how many stays, so then we're not letting people stay past that. And so, at this point, when I was talking to this person, they had a hard limit. You could only stay 90 nights over the course of an entire winter. When the shelter was open, you were only allowed to stay there 90 nights, which that's not the whole winter. So I don't know where you're going when you can't be in the shelter. But, the reality here is that we have to track people, right? Because we have to know that you're the same person that you were here 3 days ago, right? And so we have to collect your name and your date of birth, and maybe we have to ask for ID, right? Because you could give a different name, and try and get more nights at the shelter. So it's really this kind of interesting, kind of problematic way of thinking about data. So kind of what I found in terms of the kind of tracking of so-called nonprofit clients. A lot of this identification ended up coming down to doing a variety of things. So one thing was counting clients, right? Going back to that like number of people per night at the shelter, we have to have a count of how many people stay. That was one thing that we needed identifying information for. Another thing we needed identifying information for was verifying eligibility for services. So do you have certain types of income? You know, if you receive Social Security, then maybe you're not qualified to, you know, receive emergency housing vouchers or something like that, right? Like you have to collect data about the person to figure out if they can apply for, you know, various government programs or nonprofit programs. Tracking clients for sure, you know, keeping track of, you know, who's going to what shelter. You know, Boulder, I know at one point, I don't know anymore, had three different shelters. And so, you know, being able to identify the same person across each shelter, you know, was important, I guess, right? Like if you're the city of Boulder and you want to know how, you know, what is the extent to which we have homelessness in our community, like we need to know that. But also that means we have to track people, which is kind of a strange thing to want to do, especially given, you know, the people who are experiencing homelessness, you know, a fair share of them, you know, experience paranoia and are, you know, already afraid of, you know, government tracking, and, you know, so you're kind of making a bad situation even worse in the name of collecting data. So it's kind of troubling. And then finally, referring clients to other services. So, you know, going to another organization to get services. And then finally, I think this is my last set of quotes. So, you know, I talked before about that, you know, sending out a survey, you know, to collect people's experiences, you get the data back and you're like, yeah, but I still have so many questions, right? So data can only go so far in terms of understanding people and understanding the context that we're working within. So this quote, I'll just read it. We're exiting, and I'll explain it in a second because there's some confusing terms. We're exiting people, and maybe that's coming up as a negative exit or a positive exit on the report, but it's not showing the context. So the facts of what's happening on the date of exit, it seems black and white, but as we know, people are not black and white. There's more things happening that exited to destination doesn't account for. So what this person, the staff member, is talking about, and this is like homelessness specific jargon, but, you know, negative exit, positive exit goes to that outcome assessment, right? So like if someone's exiting, like if they're leaving your shelter and they're going to live with a family member, that's considered a positive exit because they're not going to live on the street. If they leave your shelter and go to back on the street, then that's a negative exit, right? And so we track those exits. So that's what that's referring to. And so what this person is saying is, you know, yeah, maybe it comes up as a positive exit or a negative exit, but like, what else is happening in that person's life on that day, right? Like, maybe they have a lot of stuff they're dealing with, and it's actually better for them to go live on the street that night. Like, they have friends, they have, you know, a warm place to stay for that night. Maybe that's a good thing. You know, we don't know. We can't say like street bad, family member good. It's not that simple always, right? So, and this is I think a excellent quote for kind of conveying that, you know, we're just missing nuance sometimes. And so, you know, this was a quote from someone who was currently experiencing homelessness, and they said, you know, in order to understand that nuance, you really have to actually sit down and talk to people, you know, to see what's going on in their lives and how they can help. It's not something you can track in logs, right? You need to have conversations with people. And I think, you know, if there's anything that like distills the essence of the trouble of data in nonprofits, it's kind of this. It's kind of like we can't really track data. I think I'll skip over that because I kind of have been pretty depressing. So I'll switch to the more positive stuff. So what do I think we can do, right? So obviously this is a you know, tricky context. It's hard. You but I think as long as we know that, and as long as we go into an organization knowing this stuff, I think we can actually make it better. So maybe I'm too much of an optimist, I don't know, but I think there are things that we can do. So what would I say can we do? So the first thing I think we should do is we should reframe that anticipatory discourse. So we should not talk about technology as like, we're gonna come in and revolutionize the way you do your work, right? We have to be careful about what we think that technology is going to do. So doing that, right, we can do that individually, but I think as society more broadly, I think we need to, that's not something that we're going to change on an individual level. That's kind of more of a cultural shift. And to be honest, I don't know how we're going to do that, because Elon Musk does something and it's like automatically cool, right? So we have to somehow shift that culture. And I don't know how to do that exactly, but I think that's important. And then in terms of data, so the second point, I focus less on surveillance and more on understanding. And this is, I think, something that we all actually can do when we're going into organizations. We can ask these questions and say, like, I know we need to track that identifying information for surveillance, for reporting, but like maybe we should consider how that makes people feel. And, maybe that's actually the opposite of what we're trying to do. Maybe we're actually pushing people away by asking those questions. And so, I think asking critical questions of, what we're doing with the technology and what we're doing with data, and getting more diverse perspectives. So getting, more people's input on like what kinds of data we collect, not just, in the federal government, not just the federal government deciding it, right? Or the state government, right? Like the people who are doing the work, the people who are experiencing homelessness, what data do they think is important, and what data should we be collecting according to them? And then also, and I didn't really talk too much about this in my research, but kind of another thread of my research is really about understanding both the individual person and society more broadly, right? We can't like separate people from society. We can't say you are a person experiencing homelessness and you have failed, because that person is part of society, right? And so it's not just, we can't think about individuals. We can't focus on the individual. We have to think about, what else is happening around them. And so I think if we can encourage nonprofits to ask those questions, certainly it's difficult though. I mean, so, expect that if you go into a nonprofit and ask those questions, be mindful of the fact that the reason they're asking those questions is because the people who are paying the money to do these programs want them to collect that, right? So it's going to be hard for us to kind of say like, no, you're asking the wrong questions, because maybe they don't want to be asking them either. But so again, I don't mean to make it, these things aren't simple solutions, but I think that's kind of what we have to move towards. And then finally, in terms of like, this is the computer scientist part of me that has to like talk about specific information systems and interfaces. So, our systems and our interfaces really have to embrace complexity, right? So like people are complex, and we have to, think about a spreadsheet. A spreadsheet does not convey complexity. Well, I mean, maybe if you look at it at first, it's kind of overwhelming and complex, but, you fit the world into tiny boxes, right? And that's kind of the fun thing. I mean, I like spreadsheets for exactly that reason, right? But like the world doesn't fit into spreadsheets all the time, right? Like the world is much more complicated. And so we have to have information systems that embrace that complexity, accept incomplete data, right? Like maybe sometimes we just shouldn't ask people certain things. Like we shouldn't ask them questions just because we think we need to ask them that question, right? So, but computer systems really don't like that. They like complete data, right? So we have to kind of think about systems that accept incomplete data. And then finally, deeper analysis, right? So we have to be able to think about people as more complicated, and social problems as more complicated as just like, individual failings, or, these are complicated contexts that nonprofits are working within. So I think that's my last slide. Yes. So I'll leave it on the, like, hopefully the slightly more uplifting stuff. I hate taking people who are like excited about working with nonprofits and being like, listen, it's kind of rough. But I'm sure, I know one of you said like, oh yeah, we've heard these things before. So, so I know, like it's a complicated space. And so I know you all know this. But I think, hopefully, one of the things I like about doing these kinds of talks is it like kind of makes everyone realize that like, oh, so this is happening everywhere. Like, this is not just something I've seen in this this is happening in a lot of places, right? So, and they're complicated problems. So, but we have to keep working on them, and I think that's the right thing to do. So, all right, so that's all I have. So, so any questions or anything you want me to talk more about?
This isn't a question, but just like relating to what you were talking about, how we notice these things.
Yeah.
We worked with this Safe House Denver last year, and they had like a people tracking kind of issue where they had people go to like they had multiple different programs as part of their like nonprofit, and they would like register people for each program like separately. So
Yeah.
we needed to like combine all of that data into one place. And it made me realize how important or kind of like nice it would be if a lot of nonprofits started with like some kind of technical person or some kind of like at least like kind of technology adjacent person that could organize this data or organize like how they set up these things from the beginning, because once they have like a good amount of users, I think they had a lot of users, but once they amassed that amount, it was hard for us to design the system based on what they already have.
Right.
So it was definitely interesting to see.
Yeah. And I mean, I definitely think, even to be honest, even organizations that have technical people, I think you're always going to have some of that to an extent. Like, that's just the nature of data. It just kind of is going to be all over the place. But I agree. I think like, yeah, if there were someone, someone there to help them, like at some point start to bring the data together, then yeah, it would be a huge difference for sure. Yeah. And actually, I think I have one of the things I skipped over was this cycle of disempowerment. And that's actually this bottom part, the data drift and the data fragmentation. It sounds a lot like what you're talking about. Like, there's a lot of, there's like, oh, there's a spreadsheet over here, and oh yeah, and then there was something in that email, and there's that form on that clipboard, and like it's kind of all over the place, right? So that's a pretty common thing to see, I'd say, in general in most organizations, but definitely way worse in a lot of nonprofit organizations for sure. So yeah, so thank you for sharing that. That's it's interesting to hear about projects you're doing. So yeah, if anyone has any other, I mean, it doesn't have to be questions, just other like experiences, I'd love to hear what you have to say.
I guess I have a question, particularly about how you mentioned that like a lot of nonprofits, because they're forced to work in such like a funding first oriented like sort of mindset, like they focus on their tech needs being around like what funders want.
Yeah.
As like an organization that will like meet with nonprofits often, and our nonprofit coordinators can definitely have say a lot more about this. But like as we talk to nonprofits, and if they move in that direction, like how can we find ways to help them because like we're asking the nonprofits what they need, right? And if they're going in that direction, like how can we like, as I don't know, mitigate that? Because it's hard because we don't want to like add to the problem, right?
Right. I mean, I think that if you're thinking about not adding to the problem, I think you're doing exactly what you need to be doing. Because I think a lot of technology people want to go in and be like, no, that you're doing it all wrong. Like you need to, like, you don't understand the technology. Like clearly it's your fault, right? So like the fact that you're just simply asking that question, I think says a lot about, about kind of your approach. And I think that's the most important part is like understand first what they're trying to accomplish, right? And understand that it's hard and that and to be honest, there is no technology that's going to work perfectly, so it's really often about like choosing the least horrible technology that will that will get like 90% of what they need it to be. And the other difficult thing is cost too, right? Like, I mean, we're often trying to find free things or low cost things, or at least discounted things. And so that really makes it difficult for us to like, I mean, that kind of limits our, what we can do, what we can work with. So, but I think, yeah, just the fact that you're asking that question shows that, you're approaching it the right way. And as long as you're paying attention to that, I don't think you will lead them in the wrong direction, right? As long as you're thinking about that throughout the process, then you're on the right track.
I guess I have. Oh,
Sorry,
go ahead,
go ahead.
Hui-Ling. No, you.
Okay, thank you. I just want to say thank you so much for this talk. I honestly learned so much that I don't really know where to start to ask questions, but I have one.
Okay.
And I wish I had like learned about so much of this stuff before we ever started scoping projects and so on. And so I wanted to ask a question about how you said at the end, how we should build data systems that and interfaces that embrace complexity and all of that. That is, we've built a number of interfaces or are building for nonprofits, and I'm suddenly, well, a lot of them are on very sensitive issues, and I was wondering if you would have any like suggestions towards like on a specific example, such as one of the projects this semester is building an Immobile app for the Colorado Immigrant Coalition for allowing for an interface for undocumented immigrants to report ICE violations when that comes up, in a way of collecting information and allowing the organization's people to contact them. So I bet there's a lot of considerations that go into that. This, as an example, I was wondering like, how would you consider to design it in a way that embraces complexity?
Well, yeah, and I'm really glad you asked that question, because I think that it highlights that kind of what I'm talking about here is like, this is kind of more like lifelong like stuff. This is not, right now you have to deal with the technology that you have, right? And like, you have to solve the problems that organizations, I mean, you're not gonna, invent a new, replace the entire spreadsheet paradigm, right? Like, you're not gonna do it. So, you have to, I just realized I can turn off my screen. You have to, you have to continue moving forward today, which is doing exactly what you're doing. Like, you're building that system, and that's great because they need that. And it's helping them, I'm sure, so like we have to continue moving forward given these kind of constraints that we have, right? These information systems that don't really embrace complexity, that don't, embrace nuance, all of these things. Like we just, those are things that we have to design entirely new computing systems to do, right? We can't do that with what we have now. We have spreadsheets and databases and web interfaces, I'm like, we can't, so, I think you have to keep this stuff in mind, keep it in the back of your head, and know that like what we have available currently is not really going to completely meet the needs of what we need it to do. So you have to kind of work within the constraints you have right now. And unfortunately, the technology that we have, the technology that's being developed it's not for nonprofits. People forget about nonprofit organizations. It's the third sector. It's called, often called the third sector. And it's like we think of for-profits first, we think about governments. Oh yeah, and then those nonprofits, right? So no one's really developing technology for nonprofit organizations. So it's forgotten about. So the technology that we have now is really not meeting the needs of organizations. So I think you have to continue moving forward today and next month and next year and the next 20 years, right? Using what we have, and that's what you're doing. And so I think you should definitely continue doing that. So don't think like, oh, we've done this all wrong and like we shouldn't have been doing any of this, because then you end up just like feeling overwhelmed and then you just give up, and that's not good. Trust me, I've been there. It's like, why am I doing this? Why am I using this technology? This isn't working, right? But we have to keep moving. I think we keep moving forward with that. But we keep our eye on the future of like developing these better systems that, hopefully at some point in our lifetimes will work better for nonprofits. So I'm really glad you asked that question, because I think that's a really, really important point. Any other questions or thoughts? And I'm happy to stick around for as long as you want. So we don't have to end right now, unless you have to go. And then if you have to go, then that's fine. But also, if there are no other questions, then we can end. So I'll leave that all up to you all. You all are in charge.
It seems like no questions. So yeah, thanks so much for this talk, Chris. We really appreciate it.
No problem. Yeah, happy to meet with you all. Definitely keep me up to date if you want to talk about projects or whatever. Like, I mean, obviously I'm not, right around the corner, but be happy to talk more. I love nonprofit technology stuff. So I had my email address on the first slide. So feel free to email me. It's just Bopp, BOPP at SBU as in St. Bonaventure University.edu. So feel free to email me anytime.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Have a great night.
Good night.